Hello and welcome to this video. Today is a day where I feel I should have worn a hat. Often when I wear a hat, it is because my hair has become too resplendent to be contained, and I feel like that's the sort of day I've got today. I think my hair, because I never did this, you see, I never paid tribute to the great American director David Lynch, who died a few weeks ago. And I felt bad about it. I thought it's nothing to do with music, but I thought it's been such a big influence on so many people that I should really talk about him. And I never did. The other one I didn't do a tribute to was John Sykes, who was a very important musician for me in the early days when I was a fan of Tigers for Pantang back in 1980-81. And I thought, oh, I wonder how much interest there is in John Sykes. I thought he was a guitarist that I really liked, but apparently I forgot about Whitesnake and all that bit. So I missed out on that. So this isn't really a tribute to them, but, you know, I just wanted to say that John Sykes at one point was the guitarist on the planet for fast-picking, intense metal guitar playing. Around about 1980, he was the guy, him and Gary Moore. And David Lynch has created an aesthetic that you could almost say that something's Lynchian, or this is like David Lynch, you know what it is, you know. On this video, I'm going to be doing something that I haven't done before, but I thought was a really interesting thing. Is I'm going to put two albums up against each other. They're going to be really different, but they're going to be the sort of albums that we would cover on this channel, and they're going to be albums that I have covered and I want to go back and talk about more, because that often happens, you know, when you're doing top tens. You think, I want to go and talk more about this album. So the two albums are going to be sort of pitting against each other are this one here, Francis the Mute by Mars Volta. Or, as it says on the spine, the Mars Volta. There's only one, and this is them, Francis the Mute. And the other album I'm going to be talking about on here is going to be this Julian Priester album called Love, Love, which is a jazz rock fusion classic. These are the two albums I've had in the car this week. I've been listening to them over and over again. One has come out as a winner in terms of my listening habits, and all I'm going on is the one I'm reaching for more and the one I'm reaching for less. Now, what's interesting is both of these albums on paper I should love, and I do like them. What do I mean by that? Well, if we take the Mars Volta. So Mars Volta emerged in the early 2000s. They brought an album out called Deloused in the Chromatorium or something like that. I'm no expert on Mars Volta. I think this was their second album. I think there'll be a lot of people saying, oh, well, you should have been checking out the first album. This one's not as good, because that always happens if that's the case. I recently covered this album when I was going through albums that are 20 years old. This album's 20 years old. And when it came out, my mate had, a friend of mine called Phil, he had the Deloused album, and I listened to it. And I can't remember why I didn't like it back at the time. I didn't hate it. I thought it was cool, but I didn't want to buy it. That's the way I saw it, because I wasn't in the business then of doing reviews and talking about music on YouTube. So I listened to it. Well, I don't really like that. I'm not going to get that. It's all right. See why my mate likes it. And this is a band that was swirling around in a whole bunch of bands at that time. That as metal had that resurgence in the early 90s with Nirvana and Soundgarden, and then you had Rage Against the Machine and Pantera. And then you'd have the sort of emergence of Dream Theater, this progressive rock, progressive metal. And at this time, you had bands like Coheed in Cambria and Mars Volta, and they were exploring quite a heavy area, somewhere between, you know, heavy rock, heavy metal, progressive rock, out there psychedelic rock, and almost avant-garde stuff, you know, almost like jazz fusion. And the Mars Volta emerged, and everyone was saying, oh, they've been listening to the Mahavishnu Orchestra and King Crimson. And I thought, oh, I've got to hear this. My mate picked up the first album, and I went round and I listened to it. And I know exactly why I don't like it now. Now I'm listening to it as a much older man, 20 years older, and I'm more analytical. I can see why I didn't like it. But coming back to it again, this is way better than I remembered it 20 years ago. What we have on this album here is a very exciting and quite avant-garde mix of old school rock, almost like Black Sabbath, modern metal. I would think System of a Down. In fact, John Theodore's the drummer on this album, who was the drummer, I believe, at that time with System of a Down. He could may well be now. It's not a band I know loads about, but I really like System of a Down. and I thought he's a great drummer. He's quite virtuoso in places. It's very proggy in its structure. So when we look at the rear cover, you see, we have all these tracks that have multiple chapters, and they're all called things like Cassandra, Gemini. In Miranda, that ghost just isn't holy anymore. And then they're broken down into all these different chapters. And when you put it on, I can't tell what the hell on the album. So you just get lost in this morass of this big Francis the Mute morass. And what I don't understand is if you open it up here, then you get another track here. And I don't know where the order is the track. The album doesn't help you. It's like, you know, and the other thing I noticed, someone might be able to help me out here, right? If you look at this album, right? So that's the cover, isn't it? Okay? And when you turn it over, it's got the same thing, but it's upside down. But he's got his arm out here. Why has he got his arm out and not there? So there's all these things. So I'm looking at this going, oh, maybe is there anything else different? And they're all, is it like one of those things where, you know, when you're a kid, you have the annuals and they have the little 2 pictures to the side and you have to say all the things that were different. So I spent some time doing that. And I like all that. See, that's all very proggy, that is. There's a lot of avant-garde stuff on here. There's a lot of long-winded sort of, I don't know if they're improvisations, but sort of quite abstract stuff. I think someone on the comments, they had a friend and they said they'd lent them that album, that Mars Volta album, and they come back and they said something like, are you having a laugh? Normal people would balk at this album. It's pretty out there. I love it. I don't mind out there at all, but normal people would balk at that. So it's quite surprising that this album was actually, you know, was not some avant-garde jazz album or weird prog album in the world of prog. This was sort of mainstream rock at the time, I suppose. I can remember the magazines were covering them a lot, and I find it quite surprising. And when you look at this album here, this is back when CDs are just dying a death, 2005. It says Francis the Mute, and it says featuring The Widow. I don't know if that was the single that was on, you know, the TV at the time, or whatever MTV was at that point. So the thing about this album, it's not obscure. This is not a mainstream album, but it's not one of these obscure, weird jazz fusion albums that I talk about on the channel. And for that, it is very experimental and outlandish. Now, the guy that is behind all this, I can't remember his name, Omar something, and I'm sure there's people watching this that know far more about it than me. Omar Rodriguez Lopez, you know, he's the guy behind this. And obviously there's some sort of Mexican, Spanish influence going on, which I really like. You know, there's a little bit of that in there. So it's all, at some points it does sound like a cross between Desperados and Star Wars of the Bible Black. That's the sort of territory we're in. Now, I'll give you my opinion about it. What I didn't like when I heard it back in 2005 is it sounded very, very clinical to me. And now, many years later, when the computers, Pro Tools, quantizing and retriggering and all the stuff that happens in modern rock production is so much worse, it actually sounds quite refreshingly real. John Theodore's drumming sounds like an actual drummer drumming to me now compared to a lot of the stuff we have. But back then, the sort of processing of it and the nailing of absolutely every single beat, which is probably through the performance and just winding up a little bit on the computer, was a little bit off-putting. But what I really didn't like was the mix. And I don't think I was intelligent enough back then, you know, and I was in my 40s, but I just thought, well, I don't like the sound of that. I don't like the production. We've had 20 years with this sort of production. And back then, we had, of course, this loudness war that was going on. You know, people are bringing CDs out. You know, they're trying to get stuff on the radio. They want everything to be louder than everything else. Now, because of Spotify and Bandcamp, there are actual rules in terms of where you want to master your stuff. And everyone just does exactly the same. So everything is sort of maxed out at minus 14 lufs. That's what you have to have everything at. So it's over-compressed to me, and it would have sounded more over-compressed back then in 2005 when my ears are much more used to listening to, you know, stuff 20 years before then. But also, it's very middly, and it's very middly around the vocals and the guitar, especially the vocals. The vocals has all got that slight loud hailer sound. And I think that what you've got going on here is an attempt to have a band which is basically some weird progressive rock psychedelic Spanish band, but it has modern, at that time, the modern production techniques that were sort of ruining rock. And we didn't know it was ruining rock at the time in 2005. And so the number one issue I have with this album is that middly mix, which is just hard on my ears. So every time I put this on in the car, when I get into the music, I'm a terrible one for turning it up. I'm a drummer, you see, so I'll turn it up, by the time I've got to where I'm going, I'm full out on the stereo and everything is pumping, and people are like thinking, what the hell's going on? Because I'm not sitting around, listening to, bloody Dire Straits or Fleetwood Mac. I've got some wailing avant-garde jazz, which is echoing across the roads. People think that someone's trying to kill a donkey somewhere. That's what happens when I'm listening to it. But with this one, I find myself just cranking it down all the time. Oh, it's harsh, crank it down, just turn it down. And the music doesn't want to be turned down. I really think this could do with a remaster or a remix. There probably is a version that's been remastered and remixed. We will find out. This isn't my original copy, however. I don't know when this one came out, but this isn't my original copy. So I got rid of my album, and then my mate has passed me on to it. Thank you, Richard. Richard, the Bigfoot hunter. The other thing I don't like about it, however, is I find it slightly pretentious. I find it that there's guys that can play. They've grown up listening to Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, all that types of King Crimson, and they're trying to be avant-garde, but they don't really get it. They think it's just about making lots of noise. And this album goes on for a long time, but actually there's a lot of points where they are just, setting up some weird textural things. And it's not beautiful ambient textural things. It's often quite ugly and electronic. Now, I think the problem here, again, is another cultural thing. When CDs came out, if you dropped an album on a CD that was like 35 minutes long, it didn't seem like you got much for your money, did it? We ought to get new CDs. And so albums started to come out, and the album length went from 35 to 40 minutes to around about an hour and 10 minutes. And so everyone's bringing out these long albums. This is one of these albums. This would have to be a double album in the old days. And so there's a lot of material, and there was a pressure on artists then to create an hour and 10 minutes album. And when that happens, you start to do a lot of this sort of, treading water stuff, which they do by bringing out a lot of avant-garde stuff. And I feel like they go, you're only doing this to seem weird. Okay? And it's not great. There's John Frusciante appears at one point in time. What track's he on? He's on the very Spanishy one, La Via Viajes. He's on that, and he plays some. He plays a couple of guitar solos, and they're all right. John Frusciante is a very good guitarist. The Red Hot Chili Peppers being one of the biggest bands in the world, Frusciante is that line from that mainstream band through to all his avant-garde stuff. And it's nice to hear him play, but, I know he's a very technical guitarist, actually. He's able to play like Zappa tracks and stuff like that. But as a soloist, it's sort of wild pentatonic soloing, and there's a lot of wild pentatonic soloing there for me. There are certain moments which are absolutely sublime, where they get into areas of rock which are like beyond rock, and I find that very exciting. King Crimson did this with the Starless and the Bible, Black and Red. It's rock music, but beyond rock. It's like there's a heaviness that heavy metalers expect, but there's another heaviness up here, which is not. Sabbath had it. I've gone nuts on Black Sabbath recently. They can't be touched. And one of the astonishing things about Black Sabbath is their first album, Black Sabbath, followed by Paranoid, followed by Masters of Reality, followed by Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, followed by Sabotage, Volume 4. I've missed that one out, but probably their greatest album. That run of albums is almost flawless. And each one is absolutely different. And each one has an abstract quality which seems to come from almost like a naivety. But it's so sophisticated at the same time. When you get to Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, they do falter a little bit. But up until that point is a run of perhaps the longest run of a mainstream band just hitting it exactly right all the time. And it's fascinating what they're doing because they're experimenting, they're pushing the boat out. And Sabbath are committed to heaviness in a way that all the metal bands that come afterwards aren't. Their heaviness does not come about from being the loudest or the crunchiest, most distorted guitar, or the fastest drumming, or screaming, or all these things that actually seem quite adolescent. Sabbath create heaviness in a much more sort of romantic, aesthetic way. It's a commitment to heaviness. And that heaviness starts to then line it up. The heaviness becomes the profound and sublime aspect that I believe heaviness represents. So a lot of metalers, when they start to get into like thrash metal and death metal, and they're pushing it, they want to start, they suddenly discovered, free jazz, maybe Last Exit, Peter Broxton, Ascension, all these albums start to come in, and those are very heavy albums as well. And so with that, I now move on to this one, this Julian Priester album. I think the reason why I have brought these two together to discuss today is because they're both dealing in sublime heaviness. Okay? So, Julian Priester is a trombone player. He's a little bit older than the Fusion guys. He was born in 1935. He's still around, so he's 90 this year. He played with all sorts of people throughout the late 50s, early 60s. On the free jazz end, American free jazz end of the market. So that's what Julian Priester is. In the early 70s, he signs up to ECM Records. This is on ECM Records. And it's lovely to see an album like this, not with some psychedelic cover that you would expect at that time, but with this beautiful, Spartan, not harsh, but Spartan cover, ECM cover, beautiful. And in 1974, he goes and records this album. Now, this is a jazz rock album. Okay, this is a jazz rock album. And recently, I put it on number 2 in essential jazz rock albums that you might not own. All right. I hadn't heard about this until recently. And when I checked it out online, I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. Why did I not know this? Right. And I feel like this with a lot of albums, but with this one, I kept listening to it. I kept going back to it. So not only did I know it was heavy, but I wanted to keep listening to it. So I've just gone and bought it. And this is my copy that arrived about a week ago, and it's been in the car since. I've got a rack of CDs in my car. I keep putting this on, which is interesting because this is not an easy listening album. It is, it's basically got 2 tracks on. The first track, which I imagine would have been on side 1 of the album, is called Prologue, Love, Love, and it's 19 minutes and 25 seconds long. The second track is called Images, Eternal Worlds, Epilogue, which is 18 minutes long, okay? Now, the lineup's very interesting on here because Julian Priester is playing bass, tenor, and alto trombones and baritone horn. So there's a lot of brass on here, but he's also playing post horn. God knows what that is. A whistle flute, cowbell and small percussion, and ARP synthesizer, 2600 prototype ARP string synthesizer. So this has come out in 74. Now, if we go back over to the fusion band that's explored this territory more, it's Weather Report. And in 74, Weather Report is, they've just done Sweet Nighter, and they're about to do Mysterious Traveller. Now, Sweet Nighter, that album is very close to the sound on this. So when Jazz Fusion happened, it came out of a whole group of sources, but one of the one of the areas that birthed jazz rock, I suppose, was Miles Davis' experience in the late 60s, especially Bitches Brew, Big Fun, this sort of electric, funky jazz. And a whole bunch of artists carried on in that vein, whereas you had the Mavish Ducks during the Return to Forever's pursuing a much more heavier, proggy way of going about things. And if you are into Bitches Brew, which I am, one of my favourite albums of all time, there's a whole bunch of incredible post-Bitches Brew albums. I would put Joe Zawinul's first solo album from 1971, the Mawadishi albums by Herbie Hancock that also include Crossings and Sextant, and then a lot of the solo albums that spin off from that. Eddie Henderson's album's pretty heavy. Bernie Maupin does a great album as well around that time. Very, very out there, that one is. I would say that I would have said that the greatest one of all these, so this is a contentious opinion, is the Eddie Henderson solo album from 73, 74. But that just sounds like Mawadashi or Crossings, but it's very heavy and fiery. This one goes beyond it. Julian Priester is onto something incredible on this. Now, the lineup's very interesting. We've also got Pat Gleason on synthesizers, who was the guy working with Herbie Hancock at that time to create the sort of soundscapes that come out of these synthesizers, which at the time were really hard to program. He sometimes gets called Dr. Pat Gleason. I don't know if he is a doctor and what he would be a doctor of. I don't imagine they had doctors of synthesizers back then, did they? You got Hadley Calaman also on flute, saxophones, bass, clarinet. We've got Bayete Umbra Zadinko. Now, there is a fusion pianist called Bayete. I assume that's that guy called Pianos and Clavinet. This is this era where these people that are making these albums, a lot of them, the African-American ones, have taken on a sort of African name to go before their name. They all did this. So you got Niimbo Henry Franklin on the bass. You've got Ndugo Lee and Chancellor on drums. Mugandu David Johnson on flute, soprano, saxophone. Kameo, oh God, I hate when I have to read out these words. Kameo, I look like a stupid English fool, don't I? Kameo Eric Gravatt on drums and congas. You've got Ron McClure on Fender bass and Bill Collins on electric guitar. Now, this is why I wanted to talk about this. It's because, you know, it said it's got Bill Connors on a guitar. Now, Bill Connors is a little bit like Tommy Bolin. There's these two guitarists that come into jazz rock fusion and they bring in the rock element in. Post John McLaughlin, these guitarists emerge. Tommy Bolin probably most famously on Spectrum by Billy Cobham, and Bill Connors on the very first Return to Forever album, Hymn to Seventh Galaxy. And but with Tommy Bolin, after making some incredible albums, eventually earning Deep Purple, and he really comes from the rock side. He died of a heroin overdose in 1976. Now, Bill Connors didn't die of a heroin overdose. He's still around. But what happened to Bill Connors was, after taking part in two of the greatest jazz rock fusion albums of all time, which would be Hymn to the Seventh Galaxy, and also Stanley Clarke's second solo album, which is incredible, he then decided to go towards acoustic music, signed up with ECM Records, and he made an album of sort of classical influence guitar, acoustic guitar playing, called Theme to the Guardian. And then he carries on in that vein throughout the 70s. There's some very interesting albums. He returns to the electric guitar in the late 80s, early 90s, but for me, sounds very similar to Alan Holdsworth. And I'm going, well, where's this Bill Connors? So this Bill Connors electric guitar sound, which is wild abandon, Hendrixy, John McLaughlin area, but he, like John McLaughlin, has the jazz language. He's got the vocabulary there. Plus, he has this facility of playing the electric guitar fast and bending and all that type of stuff. So, for those of you who agree with me that Bill Collins is this like magical period, it's like this. It's like a James Dean film. There's hardly any of them, you know. This album is also in there. Now, he only appears on track one. Now, when I look at the credits inside, what I find also very confusing is that we've got two drummers on here, both of whom played with Weather Report. Eric Gravatt played on I Sing of the Body Electric. And then, in sort of Bill Connors style, he also disappears off the map. You know, and a really incredible drummer. So again, there's only a few albums that we have Eric Gravatt on. And Ndugu goes on to become one of the greatest session drummers of all time, you know, playing with Michael Jackson and all sorts of stuff. Appearing I think the following year actually, on Tail Spinning by Weather Report. Now, to my ears, this sounds the wrong way round, because the first track on here is basically 18 minutes. It's quite incredible, of just this funky bass line in 15. It's in 15/4. And it just cycles around this bass line and goes on like that for 18 minutes. But I believe there's some very, very clever composition at work here, because although that bass line's going through and it doesn't really change that much, you have certain themes emerging and then themes going away, and the soloists coming in quite an orchestrated fashion. And having the electric guitar in there, especially when Bill Connors, around about the 10-minute mark, does his electric guitar solo, which is not like what he does with Return Forever. It's distorted. There's quite a lot of phase on there, but it's a lot more psychedelic, and it moves and weaves in. And having that electric guitar in this type of mix actually gives this an edge, which takes you back to, you know, tracks that are on Big Fun with John McLaughlin, On the Corner, Bitches Brew. I rate this album very, very highly. The second track, which sounds like it's got Eric Gravatt on, which is a lot more free jazz and a lot more orchestrated and doesn't do the same thing. It opens up quite, you know, spacey, there's ambient. And then it goes into a very avant-garde section of free jazz, but integrating electronics. I love this type of stuff, and it's so rare. Herbie Hancock's band explored it to some extent on Sextant, but this one is further out. And then it relaxes into quite a frenetic riff, a lot more jazz orientated. To my ears, I can't tell the drummers apart, really. I don't think I know they're playing that well, but knowing the styles they play, Eric Gravatt would have been more suited to play on the second one than Ndugu. And Ndugu you'd expect to be on the first funky one, and yet they've got the credits the other way around. Now, whether this is Julian Priester doing something quite clever, I don't know. And I think that's what pulls me in with this album. You know, I think with jazz, you get to know the characters there. You get to know what's going on. You start to see the fight. You start to see where people are trying to work against each other and also work with each other. And you start to get involved with what's going on. And that requires a level of musical ability that a lot of people will just dismiss as being all pretentious. He's just showing off. It's not showing off. What it is putting the focus on music rather than putting the focus on cultural relevance or being cool. And for me, the big difference between these two albums is that Julian Priester is the real deal. And even though there's no power chords or riffs, this is heavy like Black Sabbath is heavy to me. Whereas the Mars Volta seems it has a pretense towards heaviness, and the substance isn't quite there. And this is why, although I'm a massive fan of rock music, I would always go for AC/DC over a lot of this sort of avant-garde prog stuff that I get sent all the time. People say, check this out. And this is what happens with the Mars Volta. When somebody says, oh, do you like the Mars Volta? And I go listen to them. Now, and this is really dealing, I think this is what the substance of this video is. We're really dealing with this accusation of eliteness, of being an elite. And I criticise the elite all the time. And I criticise this idea that the elite control music and they let the elite through much easier than they will let the non-elites through. And I'm very aware of all this. But in terms of listening to music, the big question here is, now let's not put it like that. If you could have a brilliant musician, does that respond with a brilliant listener? And I think it does. I think that this is not sport, it's not cookery, it's not about taste. I actually think that there's something that goes beyond just mere entertainment with music and art. And I think that once you start to realise what is going on and the sort of course, you could argue that everything's entertainment, but the sort of entertainment we're discussing, which nourishes the soul and gives us a view of the world, which is actually really useful for human beings because it makes it a better place. That aspect of art, you have to work at that. And those people who just, stick their iPod in their ears when they go training and just listen to whatever's on the Spotify top 10, they literally, their listening is not as developed as people who have worked with it and considered it, because my appreciation of this album has been hard fought for. When I first heard Bitches Brew as a youngster, I didn't understand it, but I kept listening to it and I worked it out by asking questions and assuming, and this is the big thing that we don't have nowadays in our society, assuming that these great artists know what they're doing and it's me, right? So I find all the time, especially with the internet, and it will all be like back, is you put an idea out there, and as a teacher, when I was teaching kids art, music, culture, all the stuff, philosophy, whatever I used to cover, I found that anything that was intuitive, you didn't need to teach. But anything that was counterintuitive, and there's tons of things in the subject which is counterintuitive, you need to teach. Those are the things you teach. Now, if you were teaching, say, plumbing, and there was something that you would assume you'd have to switch the water off at that point, and then your teacher was teaching plumbing and said, no, we keep the water on for this one. Why is that? Oh, because of this, and you go, oh yeah, that's actually quite counterintuitive. You think you need to turn the water off. I'm making something I don't know what I'm talking about. That's the whole point. I do not know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about plumbing. But when you go into the realm of art, it's as though this cultural aspect, you are not allowed to go near. It can't be that you could state, look, I'm a musician, I'm a trained musician, I have listened to lots of different albums, and I have been in a situation where I've gone, I don't understand this. This just sounds like something kids would do, or just sounds like noise, or it sounds like they're out of tune. But I have worked on it, and I have been able to advance my hearing, that my hearing can actually go in, like somebody turning up a crime scene. A detective can see things that we can't see, and it's the same thing with the listening experience. And this is the big reason why I challenge this idea that everything's about taste, it's all subjective. It is all subjective, but not in a way where we can't have quality and value and actually create a hierarchy of quality and value. We're quite happy in our society to create a hierarchy of identity, which I find disgusting, but we don't want to actually have a hierarchy of value. So to have a hierarchy of value would to say we really don't like this thing. And this goes into morals and ethics. The war that's going on out there at the moment, and I'm not on either side. People think that one side disagree with them, I'm on the opposite side. We have sort of the religious right who go, there's an absolute morality that comes from him up there. And then you have a sort of postmodernist left go, no, the world means nothing. It's just a material nothingness. And, it's all socially constructed and there's no such thing as actual truth categories and morality doesn't play a part. And of course, neither of those positions should be held or should be considered as being absolute, because that's where the problems lie. And so I've realized in trying to compare these two, it's because my gut feeling was that there's something a bit fake about Mars Volta, and there's something really, really real about Julian Priester, and yet the general public would probably think there's more fake with Julian Priester because it's so much harder to grasp at what is going on that album than the Mars Volta. And both of them are so removed from normal people that normal people would think all of it is like, are you having a laugh? And it's that, are you having a laugh, right? Which is the antithesis to civilization. And that's the big message of this video. Bloody hell, that's quite heavy, that is. Think about it. Elitism is required. Most of us don't know how any of it works. Not how the economy works, how science and technology, not how art. We don't understand philosophy. We don't really understand how politics works or how systems work or people and all these things that we have experts in. None of us really know how it works. And if it all collapsed and we had to restructure it, we would be running around trying to work out how to get fire going again. Because most of us are not civilized. We just are controlled by the civilization that surrounds us. And we get to choose in our Western civilization the one we want. And we choose a Western democracy where you vote for who you want and then we all complain about it. But there's other ones you could have, like the totalitarian ones that seem very popular at different points in time. We don't know, do we? We don't understand. This is the Achilles heel of human beings. And as my mom used to say, if I said something that was very, like I knew, so I know this, Mom, I know, and all that, she'd say you don't know. And I think that is culturally what we need. We just don't know. We don't, nobody really knows, right? And everyone's trying to make out they do know, all right? And it's ironic that on this thing where I'm saying, the proof of this is the fact that you can, as a listener, train yourself to be able to understand a higher level of quality coming at you. Moral, ethical quality, aesthetic quality. Think about that. That's quite shocking, isn't it? Really, if you really understand this fully. Because it is the case. And those of you who are saying it's not the case, it's because you don't know. That the experience that I got as a young guy when I'd been listening to Pitches Brew for 4 weeks, and I had the headphones on one night, and I'm sat there going, what the hell is this album about? What is this album about? I mean, all my favourite musicians are on it. It just sounds like they're noodling, and it goes on for ages as well, and it's really boring, and and then I thought, they got to be up to something. There's got to be some sort of structure. And I can hear Miles Davis, he's telling them things. So there's something good on this, really, really good, but I can't tell what it is. And then I remember thinking, maybe the top bit I'm listening to all that some mad solo that's going on. And maybe that's not where it is. Maybe that's on the top. So I think that's where I should be listing. But maybe I should be listing down below. And so I start to listen. There's two bass players on there. There's Dave Holland doing all his thing. But they got this, Harvey Brooks, who I've chatted to on Facebook. And he's a key musician, Harvey Brooks is. Harvey Brooks was part of Bob Dylan's Electric Band. The great Tom Wilson, who was a producer of Cecil Taylor, Frank Zappa, Bob Dylan, Coltrane, and saw the link between these two. So the electric bass player that was playing with Dylan jumps across and plays on Bitches Brew. And these bass lines are where it's rooted. And when you focus onto those bass lines, without that bass line becoming a part of you through repetition, right? It's the repetition of that, because the repetition is real. And so it slightly changes all the time, but it anchors what's going on around it. And then what Miles Davis is doing is basically organising layers of energy that are moving around within the band. And that's multi-layered. And even on a rhythmical point of view, a lot of the time you will hear a drum beat holding down, while another drummer's playing down, and another holding a half-time beat down, and then the third drummer is just improvising, like expressing themselves based upon the solo. And once you start to understand where the organisation lays and tell yourself, this is organised different to other music, that's why I don't get it, because the organisation that I've learned is different. And then you start to say, why is Miles Davis doing this? And the thing is what he's doing is negotiating how people work together, and he's showing you new ways of reacting and working together as a group at a point in the 1960s when people are saying, how do we work together as a group? You see? And jazz has always dealt with this. How do people work together? And Julian Priester, this is his own take on here. And one of the interesting things with that opening track, which is difficult to get, is if you go and listen to this Julian Priester album, put it on, and listen to the bass. And the bass, it's very difficult to do the same thing over and over again. It's very difficult. It's a cool bass line. It goes. So that there, that's flat 7-1. So that's voicing minor or dominant. It's great that routing is open. So the players can go, well, it could be dominant, it could be alto dominant, it could be minor. It allows it to open up. And at the end, that line has a tendency to suggesting the dominant of that tonic. But these two things are vague, and it allows the soloists to create worlds within that improvisationally. That bass line, the reason why it does that, because it's not chords doing that, it's the bass line doing that, is to do with the rhythms. And it's where they're arranged in the 15, because the 15 is also creating a kind of rhythmical cadence within the music. So when you focus on that bass line, because he's having to repeat it over and over again for nearly 18 minutes straight, because he's not in at the start, but once he comes in 17, 18 minutes, he's got to hold this bass line down. He loses it every now and then once he loses it, he holds it down, and then he finds his way back, and so this is actually subtly shifting, and this thing of the breathing of like this creates a new type of cadence, and cadences represent stories. They represent stories between people and how people relate to each other. Anyway, this is why this album is amazing. And this one, although very good, is just a patchwork of genre. And it's like someone going, we're a rock band, but aren't we? We're a clever rock band. And that is with the big problems you've got with modern progressive rock there. I like these albums very much. But as you can tell, this one for me trumps this one. I hope you enjoyed this little video. This is quite a useful thing to do, actually. So if you like this approach, then tell me you like it by putting a like on it and saying you like it. Subscribe. Please subscribe. I need some more subscribers. There's loads of different ways of supporting me. I have so many different ways of supporting me. You can choose which one you want. You could become a patron. You could become a free patron or a paid-up member of Patreon. You can support me financially with a tip. I have a PayPal tip jar. The link is down below. And there's also a little button on here I think you can press and give me some tip. I also have a Substack that you can subscribe to. It's not very much, and that's got a lot of podcasts on there. It's got a lot of my interviews on there, so you can listen to some of my interviews on the run. I do plan on doing some really long podcasts, like 3-hour discussions with people, very, very, very meandery stuff. But also on the Substack, I'm writing now, and I put a lot of my old essays up, and I'll be writing new essays. So some of these random ideas that I get into on here, I can actually explore a little bit more now, because I know I am a little bit rambly, because it's the nature of how I do these videos. I've also, on my Bandcamp, I'm moving that over to a subscription. Since I've done that, I've released 3 albums, including a new album that I've just released called Real Life, which is a proper album. Some albums are just like collections of odds and ends I've got in the studio, a jam I had. But this one has come out of a whole bunch of sessions that didn't quite make it to proper albums, and I'm very pleased with it. Came out last week, and there was a great response to it. Had some number of videos coming out. So this is the creative life, and this is what I love doing, and this is what we're talking about. And you know, if you feel that you're a creative person, either a creative listener, that's the term we should have, a creative listener. And it must be frustrating being a creative listener. And if you're a creative doer, the frustrating is that you haven't found a creative listener. Think about that. Think about that. See you on the next video.
I can tell you how. Something to say.